Afternoon. Welcome to the Salina City Planning Commission. I'm going to call this meeting to order, and all of our members are here tonight. We'll start with approval of minutes. Our last meeting was June 18th.
I move we approve the minutes.
I second it.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes as read. All those in favor, vote aye, please. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We have one item for public hearing tonight. This is item 3.1, application Z19-4, filed by the Salina City Planning Commission, requesting a comprehensive review and amendment of Section 4269 wireless communication facilities and Section 4270 telecommunication right-of-way users to bring Salina's zoning ordinance into conformance with state law and current FCC regulations. This is continued from the May 21st meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for those of you who think this subject seems to be perpetually on your agenda, you are correct in that observation, and the reason for that is that both the Federal Communications Commission and the Kansas Legislature are continuing to tinker with this subject, and the item is pressing is that 4G service has pretty much been implemented nationwide and in the city of Salina, but a lot of the wireless service providers are trying to gear up for providing 5G service, and the best means of doing that is through the installation of small cell network antennas in the public right-of-way. And so different cities throughout the country have taken different tacks with responding to that. And so what you see on the screen is what we're referring to as the small cell technology. We've had that in Salina for a few years, but the 5G network requires a much denser network and a great number of nodes and small cells than what we currently have. We've had interest expressed to the city from Cox Communication, U.S. Cellular, and Verizon about expanding their networks through the public right-of-way, and the city attorney has developed a draft master license agreement. And that's currently being reviewed by those companies. Just for the benefit of the commission, the city of Salina has franchise agreements with obviously Westar, Kansas Gas, AT&T, Cox Communications. Those franchise agreements are agreements those utilities have to utilize the city's right-of-way for their systems. And we have one with what was ID Tech and is now Zayo. We have a franchise agreement with them. But in 2019, the Kansas Legislature eliminated the ability of cities to have franchise agreements with wireless service providers, but cities can still require a deployment agreement or master license agreement, but we can't charge wireless service providers franchise fees to use our right-of-way. So the type of installations that we're talking about are either small cell antennas that are located on existing poles or are constructed on freestanding poles. We have both of those in the city of Salina. And we do have some current aesthetic standards in place, but those are housed in our zoning ordinance, and the city attorney thinks we'd be in a better position if those were moved to our public right-of-way section of the code and not housed in the zoning ordinance. But what we wanted to do was use today just to review what our options are for regulating aesthetic appearance, locations, those types of things. And before we took any action to lose or repeal what we had in our zoning ordinance, that the Planning Commission get an opportunity to see what we're proposing to substitute. So John, there is a page on the wireless communication regulations. It's just a summary of our performance criteria. This is what we currently have in place in our ordinance. And that is that if you have these small cell antennas, they have to be screened by what are called canisters, shrouds, or other screening measures. The city of Manhattan, we have an excerpt of their code. They cleverly refer to those as cantennas instead of antennas, because they're antennas shrouded in a can. And so any new or replacement support structure has to match the original or surrounding utility or light poles. So in other words, if there was a new power pole was put in to replace an existing one, it would need to match both what was there and what's in the vicinity. And the other thing is, antennas aren't supposed to extend more than 36 inches above the top of the pole. And then what's attached to the pole can't exceed 6 feet in height or 2 feet in width, or project out more than 24 inches horizontally from the support structure. And then the other item is that the support structures, if they're new or modified, they can't exceed more than 18 inches in diameter. And so when we get an application, we have this criteria checklist that we use to review those. But I don't know, John, if you could go back to the visual examples that we had. So this is what Manhattan's referring to as a cantenna, or an antenna that's contained in a shroud or camouflaged or in a canister. Our regulations say this can't extend more than 3 feet above the top of the pole. If there's any equipment that's mounted to the pole, it can't be more than 6 feet in height, top to bottom, and or extend out more than 24 inches. And so we currently encourage pole-mounted equipment. There have been some instances where these are put on poles and then they have utility boxes or ground-mounted equipment, and those are usually the situations where we get the most objections from homeowners or property owners, because they don't want that box out in their front yard or what they perceive to be their front yard. So when we talk about equipment attached to the pole, this is an example of, here's the support structure, here's the antenna, it's contained in a canister, and then this is the support equipment that's attached to the pole. Our regulations currently say this can't be more than 6 feet to here, and they can't extend out more than 2 feet. So I don't know if do we have any other photos of that example? So that's just a different view of the same thing. But they could be mounted on street lights or at traffic signals or power poles, and so we would explore all those options before we would look at people putting up self-supporting structures or adding new structures to neighborhoods. So John, we have you have kind of a summary of the FCC ruling. So before this ruling, cities could say no, we don't want this stuff in our right-of-way. As you can see, the Federal Communications Commission requires cities to allow this in some form. So it's not a question of, well, we just don't want these things in our right-of-way. Our ability to regulate is limited. Their goal is to try to facilitate nationwide demand for 5G service. Our monopoles that you see around town have a range of several miles. These small cells are about 30 feet tall, and their service range is only about a city block. So this will require more numerous and dense placements than what we see today. So we're dealing with multiple providers. Each wants to have their own infrastructure. A lot of them are trying to beat the other to get their systems up. And so our hands are tied in the following ways. So if you'd like to show us that, John. So this is really vague, but our aesthetic requirements must be reasonable based upon the locale. And we cannot be so onerous as to make it infeasible to install the proposed facility. So that is still subject to, and the aesthetic requirements must be published before April of this year. We have had ours in place for over 2 years, so we currently have aesthetic requirements in place. We just think that we're going to have to modify them and move them to the Public Works section. So John, maybe if you could find the information from the City of Manhattan. In discussing with the city attorney, the City of Manhattan's regulations are about a month and a half old. And if you could just go to the highlighted parts, John. City attorney indicates that he would like to, he thinks this would be a good model to emulate, and just, I've not seen it in other ordinances, but they use the term cantenna in their ordinance, and that's a weatherproof enclosure that protects an antenna, and so you can't actually see the antennas. They are enclosed in a canister, and Manhattan's ordinance refers to the entire structure as a cantenna. And so each antenna is located inside an enclosure, and then there's limitations on the size of that enclosure and limitations on the accessory equipment. So if you could keep scrolling till we get to some of the highlighted parts, John. Okay, so they ask that the applicant submit photo simulations from 3 locations near the facility to allow staff to review those and see what they would look like from the viewpoint of nearby pedestrians and vehicle traffic. That seems reasonable. So their preference is, if you have neighborhoods, their preference is that they be along a street or in an alley. What they're saying is if it is in residential areas, they should be placed at the common property line and not in front of the house. We think that makes a lot of sense. Where we find objections from people is if someone plants a new pole in front of somebody's front door, or they put the utility boxes out right in front of their front door or next to their driveway. So this requirement would say you need to locate it where the 2 side lot lines come together, and hopefully equidistant from adjacent poles. They shouldn't be located in front of storefront windows or walkways or entrances or things that would impede access to the building. And so they have a preference. It says within the grid street areas of the city that incorporate alleys, and we have a number of those in the central part of Salina. So placement within alleys is strongly encouraged. So if all things being equal, Manhattan expresses a preference that if you're going to put them on Kansas Avenue, that you put them in the alley and not out along the street. And then they also have a order of preference for preferred locations. First one is on an existing pole or wireless support structure in an alley. The second one's on an existing pole within an alley, or on a new pole within the alley. The third preference is on a existing support structure in the right-of-way or an existing pole. And then the last preference is actually putting up new poles within the street right-of-way. Let's see what else they have there, John. They have requirements for external shrouding. They have requirements that if you're in a neighborhood where the service lines for power are underground, then the service lines for the poles have to be underground. They have limits on sidebars installed. They require that the equipment be painted to match. They even specify a flat go-away green color approved by the city. And so they require that they be top-mounted, concealed within a cantenna, and then they have information limits on the size of ground-mounted enclosures. So there's a specific example that I worked on where there was a pole attached, or an antenna was attached to an existing streetlight pole, but they felt like they needed to put the equipment box on the ground. So they installed the equipment box in the right-of-way. Then neighbors complained that it was obstructing their view backing out of their driveway. So we went out to measure that and determined that it was. So essentially they had to go out and excavate almost a hole and then drop the box down in that hole so that its profile was low enough that it didn't obstruct the view from the driveway. And then they did plant some shrub roses around it just for effect at the request of the owner. So you have to be careful when you're talking about above ground utility boxes because you have driveways and sidewalks and things like that. So we would have to look at those very carefully. The flip side of that is that the FCC says if you don't regulate or have rules for Westar or AT&T utility boxes, then you can't have special rules that only apply to wireless communication boxes. So if we did adopt those, we would have to apply those across the board. And so if they have a new or replacement pole, they limit the height to 30 feet. So we think that many of the things that are in the Manhattan ordinance are common sense and are reasonable, which is what our aesthetic standards must be, although different parties might disagree about what constitutes reasonable. But for the Commission's benefit, we already have, I think, 34 of these facilities around the city today, and I think only 3 of them are what I would call new poles that were placed where previous poles didn't exist. And some of you may have been on the Commission when we had public hearings on locations of some of those new poles. And I think there were 5 applications, 3 of which the Planning Commission approved and 2 of which you turned down. But what we'd be looking at in the future is because FCC has put what they call a shot clock on local decision making, it's going to be really hard for us to set up a process where we would have public hearings and use permits for any of these facilities. So it's probably going to have to be an administrative decision. So if we're going to do that, we want to have the best standards that we have in place. So the purpose today is just to kind of go over why we're continuing to talk about this and to let you examine examples like from what we have from the city of Manhattan, and then to see if there's any concerns about this implementation of this type of network that you have from an aesthetic standpoint or location standpoint, because those are 2 things that we can still regulate. But as You may, if you have not noticed these around the community, then that means we've probably done a pretty good job of making them as unobtrusive as possible. But there is one that's pretty well disguised. There is a new pole that was put up right along the retaining wall of the river between the Y and Kenwood Cove. And that is a tower, it was a support structure that was put up solely to, and I approved that location as an alternative to others because it seemed the least visually noticeable in that location. So with that, we would just like to get some input from what might concern you about the increased installation of these types of facilities and what you think is important from a property owner or homeowner's perspective, and what you might like or not like about the Manhattan example.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew.
You mentioned go away green,
Mm-hmm.
so that's to blend in with the landscape?
It's to be a blend in, to be camouflage so that it's not reflective, that it's a non-reflective color, but it's kind of a neutral green so that it blends in. I have seen some that have actually been painted, I'd say, with a camouflage pattern, or like military camouflage that you would see that are a green color.
Yeah, I mean, the picture that you show out of the box that was on 10th Street was white.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. And if, you know, if it would be painted go away green, I don't know if that would do it. But I'm kind of thinking that maybe the box should match the color of the pole. So if that's a wood pole, so it should be painted brown. If it's on an aluminum pole, it should be painted silver. Black pole, black. Anybody think?
It seems to me the silver would be very noticeable. And preferably it would be something quieter.
Yeah, the ones I was, and we haven't got to that level of discussion, but one thing for a distinction, most of the power poles around town are owned by Westar, so they have to come to agreement with Westar. But for instance, at the corner of Belmont and South Ohio, there are poles there that support traffic signals as well as streetlight poles. Those poles are owned by the city of Salina, and they're silver metal poles. So if they were to put antennas on that, would you want to see to think about whether you'd want to see the equipment box painted to match the silver pole, light pole, or some neutral or not camouflage color? Would it call more attention to it if it was a silver metal streetlight pole and traffic signal pole? Would it be better to have the neutral color or make sure it matches the pole?
I would think white would stand out more than silver, but, you know, I'm very bendable.
Is there, we have not heard it specifically, but I just heard it secondhand that Westar was purchased by Kansas City Power and Light, and I was told secondhand that while Westar allowed the equipment boxes to be hung on their poles, that Kansas City Power and Light won't allow that, which would mean that the equipment boxes would most likely be mounted on the ground and not in this. So instead of hanging the equipment box on the pole, it would probably be on the ground near the pole. And so even if we were to draft something that said that, we could say that we had a preference for that, but it's the fact that the person that owns the pole and has the pole attachment agreements, if they refuse to allow the wireless service provider to attach the equipment box to the pole, if we had a requirement that it has to be, then that might not be enforceable. So I'm not sure that we can try to go in that direction if the commission thinks it's preferable to have this than to have a separate box sitting over here. But I'm not sure that we can absolutely require that if the owner of the pole won't allow it. So,
But we can require the color be specific.
yes. Do you have any thoughts about Manhattan's preference for alleys versus streets?
I think definitely.
I think everyone would agree,
Yeah.
wouldn't you?
Sure.
That it should be in the alley.
Okay. I think that was something that was, and I actually noticed from the city of Overland Park that they kind of, our ordinance that we currently have for towers on private property, we have a list of preferences, and I noticed that the city of Overland Park in their ordinance seemed to emulate ours in terms of preferences, but their preferences were for industrial areas first, commercial areas second, public property or semi-public property third, multifamily residential areas fourth, and single-family residential districts fifth in terms of their preferences or location preferences. So I said we can't simply write an ordinance and prohibit them in residential areas, but we can have preferences to steer them to, and if you think that having them in alleys is a preference, then that's something that we can work in. And you think where we currently are with limiting to extending 3 feet above the height of the pole is something that you would like to keep? Most of the ones I've seen, the limits are anywhere between 30 and 35 feet. I'm not sure we would want a series of 50-foot poles in the city of Overland Park. For ones placed in the right-of-way, they allow up to 50 feet along a thoroughfare, 40 feet along a collector, and 20 feet along a residential street. So each community is taking a slightly different approach, but in reviewing the things and similarities between the city of Manhattan and Salina, we thought we would just furnish you that example because that's the one we thought we would most likely want to try to emulate. So.
The standard utility pole is 28 feet.
Yes,
And so you're talking 3 feet on top of that?
in terms of the antenna height, yes. And what, sometimes the poles that they're looking at are, in the case of the ones we already have, the poles were pretty old or the poles were kind of bent, so they replaced the pole, and then we just carefully made sure that the replacement pole was the same height as the pole that was there before. All of the providers expressed a desire that they want to work with the community and they want to install their network in a way that is working with us and not trying to force their way onto and force their system in. So I said that the idea is that the city would enter into master license agreements with each of the providers, but this set of regulations would govern how each individual installation is, the limits on that, and what you as a commissioner, the community expects. And so, said we just wanted, before we put together something specific for you to sink your teeth into, we just wanted to give you some examples and talk about the things that we think we still can regulate. The thing that the state law did is it allows providers to submit a application for up to 25 different locations in a single application. So that would be completely impractical for us. If we tried to set up a process where we'd have public notice and hearings on these, and we had 25 submitted at once, you would be here for an entire month conducting hearings on all those locations. So I think there probably won't be any scenario in this ordinance where you would be conducting hearings and making decisions. Where you would be involved is establishing the aesthetic standards that you expect the installations to have, and where, if there's inappropriate locations like in front of the front door of somebody's house or of a business, then we would try to write that into the code like Manhattan did. So,
Commissioners, do you have any other special ideas, thoughts, or concerns?
I just need clarification. Do each of these providers, they have the possibility of having their own Cantenna? Is that right?
yes.
So you could, I mean, well, that seems like a lot. Like you could have 5 in the same, near
Yeah,
near
some
each
of
other?
it's going to be there's what we have, and I have to get my terms straight, but what we had, which was Idea Tech, came to town, and then they were turned into Zayo. They are not a wireless provider, they're a network provider, and so you have 2 categories of businesses. One comes in and tries to build the infrastructure and then sell the space to providers. So even though Verizon is interested in they only talk to us about a handful of locations because they're already on some of the ones that we have already. So I don't think it's going to be this group's going to do 30 and this group's they're going to mostly fill in the blanks. But one of the things that they did in the FCC and also through the state legislature is that we cannot force co-location.
I saw that,
And so, I mean, it's going to result in replication possibly, and it's going to result potentially in proliferation. So what we mean by that is when one of the very first towers in Salina is out at the East Crawford Recreation Center, and that's 225 feet tall, and it has 5 spots on it for 5 different providers. And so the thought was, rather than having 4 different towers in East Salina, if we construct this one and then require that it provide space for multiple providers, then you can provide the same service on one tower. So the tower at South High, the tower at Central High's Salina Stadium, all those, the one at Kenwood Cove, those were all done and required that it be built so that multiple service providers could locate on them. So even though Verizon has the tower at South High, they couldn't prohibit others from locating their antennas on it. Now, if we have a proposal to build a tower, we can't require that they design it to accommodate multiple users. Well-
I still think that the water towers should be available for antennas. You know, most cities, I would say, allow it.
There's a mixture, but you have one individual that is not convinced of that, and that's our utilities director, so that will be, he doesn't want people climbing around on our water towers hanging antennas, but that is a philosophical and policy debate, but that will be on the private side. So what we're suggesting here, first, the city attorney and I were working on trying to do a consolidated amendment where we'd address these public locations with the private side. We haven't done a new cell tower in Salina for like 8 years because the focus now is on these smaller repeater networks and not on the big towers. We have pretty good coverage from the taller towers that we have. So we think the focus is going to be on this. But we do have to go back and modify some of the things in our general cell tower regulations. But these ordinances are specifically for the small. So it's saying that there's a preference for the locations and there's a preference for co-location configurations. Essentially what that means is if you propose a co-location configuration, your path is going to be smoother, but if a provider absolutely insists that they refuse to accommodate co-locations, they can do that. But we're free to encourage them to do it, but if they absolutely refuse to, we can't say no because of that. So
Well, they would rent that, wouldn't it? You say Verizon would build a tower and then wouldn't they rent space on
Yes.
this? So it's a revenue source for them.
yeah, but it's just the way that the law was rewritten is that instead of the government being able to require that, it's up to the provider to choose that. So it's a matter of choice instead of non-choice. So that is what our plan is to take section 4270 that's in our zoning code and essentially have you recommend to repeal it. But before we brought that as an action, we wanted to have a substitute drafted for you to look at before we lost what we already have. So our thinking is that we may very well follow some of these things that the city of Manhattan has recently adopted, and a lot of these seem to be applicable to the Salina community and seems to be pretty well thought through and not unreasonable. So we won't know until we have something adopted and try to enforce it, and somebody believes it's unreasonable. We won't know what's reasonable and what's not till we try to enforce it. But that's where we are on that. So our thought would be to continue the application Z19-4 to our August 6th meeting to allow the city attorney to prepare a draft set of aesthetic standards for your review and comment. So
It's
that would be
August 6th.
August 6th.
6th. Do I have a motion for that, Commissioners?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded to continue application Z19-4 to the August 6th meeting to give time for city attorneys to review this. All those in favor vote aye, please.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Any administrative items?
We have no administrative items, I would just point out that we have an item that goes through the Design Review Board and not through Planning Commission, but we do have we have a item on Monday's City Commission agenda, the Barolo Grill, which is a proposed downtown restaurant, is proposing an outdoor dining area on the Strand Plaza back behind the restaurant on the west side, which is our first one that's not on a sidewalk, but we'll be reviewing that. And then somewhat related to that, in addition to tinkering with wireless facilities, the legislature continues to tinker with consumption of alcohol on public property and public right-of-way, and so we're continuing to work with that as it relates to plazas and to special events that might occur downtown. So one of the things that's happening behind the scenes, it's not necessarily on the agenda, is staff is spending a lot of time with trying to keep our event permits and our regulation of events downtown current with state legislative changes. So the legislature allowed the consumption of alcohol on public property downtown for special events, and then they repealed the definition and the requirement for special events and just allows it to occur, but our local ordinance still only allows it for special events. So we're working to try to constantly keep our codes up to date with what the legislature is doing. And so that's a kind of behind the scenes exercise. But in terms of, we don't have any legislative matters other than this, and we have no preliminary discussion items for you today. So that would bring us to unfinished business or new business that somebody might want to bring up. I did receive an email from Chair Freiberger about possible nominees for landscape awards. So if you see, again, if you see things that are improving curb appeal or landscaping that you think was well done, we encourage you to get that to us so we can think about landscape awards for 2019.
And when are those given?
We usually do that either the first or second meeting in October during planning month, and also for planting we use the window September 15th to October 15th is really the best time in Salina's weather for planting new landscaping. And so we have a number of projects where what we do is we enter into compliance agreements with the owners. We let them occupy their space, and then we try to give them time to complete their landscaping. So if they choose not to plant in July and August, then they can defer their planting until that period from September to October, because the plants tend to have a better chance of surviving if they're planted then than if they plant in July. You will see that one of the tenant spaces at Iron and Ohio is occupied, and they don't have their landscaping complete, but they do have a compliance agreement agreeing to have it completed by October. So if they choose to plant it now, which is not ideal, then they'll just have to be very careful about monitoring that.
And you're talking about Salina wholesale liquor?
Yes.
Now, it's retail though,
It's a retail liquor store, yes.
but they're calling it wholesale.
Well, maybe they think they have wholesale prices. I don't know. But
Well,
they're, I did sign their
Same to me.
license, and they are a retail liquor store. That is what their license is for.
I'm aware of some communities who wanted to regulate what an outlet store was because it's misleading if they're just selling regular retail and they call themselves an outlet.
Yes. Well, we also have a stand in Salina that's advertising itself as wholesale fireworks. And I don't think their prices are any different than retail fireworks, but they call themselves wholesale fireworks, so you will have to be a discerning consumer.
You'll have to check out the prices, Commissioner Baffa. Any other business?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
parking lot maintenance. What's happening there?
There have been some work done on mid-states in portions, not all of it, and there's been some patchwork done at Central Mall, but not enough. And I can't speak to the over by Cadobas because I didn't get an update on that one, but
It's getting worse, actually.
when we were out, our entire planning staff goes out and does the fireworks stand inspections, so that there's one in the Mid-State lot and there's one in the Central Mall lot, so we got exposed to that firsthand. But there was patching activity going on at both those locations, but it's not enough. They're not covering all the spots.
And so and just say if they refuse to do it, what recourse does the city have?
Well, one recourse we have is to retain the services of a contractor to go out and patch the hole and then assess that cost back to them. That would be one. That would certainly be a last resort, but it is something that can be done. It would be analogous to if people don't mow their tall weeds and grass after sufficient warning, then the city will go out and mow it for them, but then that cost will be a lien against their property. And so that would be the case with those commercial properties if it's sufficiently bad that our first step would be to try to go out and put out cones and barricades to try to make sure that people didn't stumble into that or drive through it. But there's some right where the Coles development connects with Mid-State that you could go up to tire depth in, so those things should either be coned off or barricaded. So,
Anything else? I see no public, so there will be no public forum. And if there's nothing else, we'll adjourn. Could I have a motion? Mr. Story?
Second it.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Enjoy your 4th of July holiday. Thank you. And before you know it, it'll be winter. Right?